Okay, we did it. All right, so are we all good now? I'll get started.
Perfect.
Okay, sweet. So we're Wolfpack. So how this kind of idea started is that, Bill and I are obviously, Metro Denver homeowners. We're community members. We see the homeless problem growing kind of at a rampant rate. And my sister lives in San Francisco. And so going out to visit her, I knew that in San Francisco, it was also a huge problem. And so one of a research article that I had read from a sort of Denverite who moved from San Francisco to Denver, and he said, I'm starting to see all these very similar patterns. And if Denver's not careful, if the city's not being careful with the way that they're handling the homeless problem, we're going to start to see Denver turn into San Francisco. And so that was kind of like a big light bulb for me, is like, why is the San Francisco problem continue to grow, even though they've put in $300 million into fixing the problem? And over the last 3 years, the homeless population's actually grown over 17%. So we kind of just started there. And it was like, if you're throwing all this money at something, why aren't you fixing it? And so what we started to discover, looking into like different case studies, talking to different journalists, looking at different sort of ways that the city and like the homeless coalitions have chosen to address the problem, is that we started to realize there was a lot of money put into essentially like proliferating the symptoms. So if you have an infection, but you're not getting to the root of that infection, if you're not cleaning it out, if you're not addressing it, if you're not doing the necessary care sort of steps to fix that, what you're going to have is just this prolonged infection that you keep cleaning it out and it's getting reinfected, cleaning it out, it's getting reinfected. And so that's what we started to see when we were looking at the way that
Sounds like a pandemic.
Yeah, so that's what we started to see. And I've been keeping really close eyes on how the pandemic is affecting the homeless. And as much as I hate to say it, it's a positive trigger in a way, because I think it's really waking people up that like this needs to be addressed, because the weakest part of your ability to handle a pandemic is the weakest member of your community and your ecosystem, and that is the homeless. They are the most at risk. They have weak and compromised immune systems. They do not have locations to self-quarantine, and they don't have access to resources or medical care. So when you start to look at that, I think when this kind of all finally blows over, we're going to definitely have a pathway to start talking to community leaders to address this. So then we looked at San Francisco and we're like, okay, we see where San Francisco just completely failed. Like they threw money at the problem, but they really didn't address it. They were just essentially treating symptoms, which has allowed homelessness to continue to exist, which is a problem. So when we looked at Denver, it's like, are we doing the same thing? And so this is actually a quote from Jerry Burton, who is a Denver Homeless Out Loud advocate, and he's now a member of the committee team, but he also used to be homeless, and he was a homeless veteran. And he said, the city put good money behind bad ideas. A lot of times they do that because they don't talk to people who are experiencing homelessness. And so I personally was a part of the Everyone Counts point in time survey collection. Do you all know what that is? Because if you don't, what it is it's like the one time a year for 2 days that the city actually gets the ability to go out and collect census data on the like invisible demographics. And the problem with it is that those 2 days, that collection dictates all the budgeting, all of the funding, how we set up our business finance strategy for the homeless for the rest of the year. And that's problematic because that's a very small amount of data. And we're using that data to basically say like, oh, well, we know the homeless, we understand this problem, we know how to address it. And we don't, because I'm frozen. Do you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. My screen will be frozen. I don't care. So we started to look at the way that money was being spent, how it was going into shelters. And so one of the things that was really alarming when we were doing our census data is that given night in the city of Denver, there are enough homeless shelter beds to house every single homeless individual that we currently have accounted for. But the problem is that there could be 2 feet of snow outside, and there could be, it could be 20-degree weather, and hundreds of homeless individuals are willingly like choosing to stay outside instead of using these shelter beds. And so we're sitting here and we're thinking, this is a user experience problem. Like, you don't understand your user. And Bill and I went and interviewed like 10 different nonprofits. And as much as I love what they're doing and we've created really good partnerships with them, we walked away from each one of these meetings kind of having the same like gut feeling, like they don't really know their user. Like, they don't fully know what they're doing, which is very, very scary, because those are the people that are in the front lines trying to advocate for homeless rights, trying to, make changes, make things better, but they're not understanding their user. And so that's where we started. So this is kind of just a recap of the research that we've done over the last year. because we wanted people to understand that like we aren't coming from this in this kind of like egocentric way of like, oh, we think we know how we can help the homeless and we're just going to be these like spearheads of change. It was like, no, we're going to actually spend the time interviewing the homeless. And so between Bill and I went out and probably interviewed over 100 homeless individuals during that point in time survey collection, asking them questions like, how long have you been homeless? What brought you to homelessness? Like, if you had one person that you could go to, if you needed help, who would it be? And one of the scariest sort of things that we got out of those interviews is when we were interviewing an at-risk homeless population, they had like, I don't know, 35 kids in the room that are all like on their way to being like full-time homeless because they're coming off of government resources, they're turning 18, they have no one to go to. And so the woman who was running the program, she asked all the individuals, she said, if you had one person, just one person you could go to, whether it be for help, guidance, financial support, just somebody that you could go to in your life that's like an adult who could take care of you, raise your hand if you have somebody like that. And less than half the population in that room was able to raise their hand. And so that was one of the key things that we started to realize, is that there isn't a social capital for them. There isn't civic engagement. Like, they don't have people that they can go to. And so when we started to outline our user persona, we started to see these really key themes come about that were these sort of barriers to entry that nobody was addressing. So this is Joe. He's our sort of homeless user persona. He's the person that we ran into the most when it came to chronic homelessness. And so chronic homelessness is defined as like a person who's been in and out of homelessness for more than a year. They often have either a physical or a mental disability. And so it makes, dealing with their homelessness that much more difficult because they're often not being treated for those symptoms. They don't have access to mental health, like psychologists, drugs, they have PTSD. And so they have these underlying addiction problems that are being caused by the fact that they have a, untreated or undiagnosed mental or physical disability. And so what makes matters worse is that most of them do not have identification, and they do not want identification. When we worked with Mile High United Way, they do these major fairs every single year to try to get the homeless IDs. And they said that it is one of the most difficult things that they have to try and accomplish. And I was like, well, why? Like, if you're taking care of most of it for them, like, why is it so hard for them to get IDs? And she goes, they don't trust anybody. They don't trust the government. They sure as hell don't trust the police. Like, a lot of these people are choosing to stay invisible and homeless and unidentifiable for their own safety. And that's because they're afraid that they're going to be persecuted or judged or even potentially criminalized for like unpaid parking tickets, or the fact that they have some sort of misdemeanor drug selling crime from 7 years ago and they've, skipped out of town. And so they're, these are people with like very low level crimes. That's not to say that some of them aren't dangerous. Like, yes, you'll get that, but a lot of them are just terrified of government resources and the police. So they don't want to be ID'd. Well, then that creates a further string of problems. If you don't have an identification and you don't have a physical permanent address, you can't get a bank account. So the homeless to work programs that you see across the country, they have it in Fort Worth, Texas. They have it in Little Rock, Arkansas. They've tried to do it in Denver as well. When we went and we looked at these programs that exist, it's the same thing over and over again. We pick you up for the day, you work, we feed you, and then we pay you out in cash. Well, that's really problematic, because if you're paying a homeless person out in cash, you're now suscepting them to basically spending all that money at once because they don't have the financial sort of prowess or knowledge to think to save it. But they're also just having cash on them now. And homeless theft in between homeless individuals is a huge problem. So now you've given them money and you actually haven't benefited them in any way. You've made the problem for them worse because they're worried about being robbed, or they're going to go spend it on crack right then and there. Like, those are essentially their options. So this concept or idea of like building wealth and like saving and storing assets doesn't really exist for them because there's no way to protect it. So now we're looking at this kind of situation that even if a homeless individual wanted to get a job, there's not really an accessible labor market that accounts for the fact that being homeless is essentially a disability. So when we went out, we interviewed a lot of the homeless, like, do you want jobs? Have you worked jobs? If you had a job, what happened? And a lot of the feedback I got over and over and over again was that people essentially got fired or laid off for the simple act of being homeless. So when we say there's no accessible labor market, what we're talking about is that there's not an employer that understands Joe came to work late because he got kicked out of a shelter at 4 a.m. Or Joe's not doing great today because he hasn't eaten a meal in 2 days. Or a customer complained that Joe smells bad because he doesn't have access to a shower. Like, there is not a labor market or an understanding that looks at being homelessness as a disability and like trying to work with them and taking that into account. And so the other issue that we found when working with El Centro Humanitario de Trabajadores sorry, that's a mouthful. They're a special nonprofit in Denver that specializes in focusing on day laborers, many of them being Mexican Americans or illegal immigrants. And so one of the alarming statistics was that last year in the state of Colorado, 6 out of 10 day laborers, which are like your lowest wage workers, reported wage theft from their employer. So like the people that are supposed to be watching out for them and like paying them and like helping them get their lives together are actually stealing their wages. So they don't have a way to protect their wages, even if they did get paid out. There's not an accessible labor market for the conditions and the adversity that they have to overcome. And then to make matters worse, the people that are supposed to be looking out for them are essentially taking advantage of them. And so what this creates is called learned helplessness theory. And it's a like psychological sort of breakdown of the brain where the human body and the brain says to protect yourself, stop caring. Like you are going to become this learned helpless creature because every time you try to get better, every time you try to change your life or do something better, some sort of outside societal constraint said, no, fail. And so when that keeps happening over and over and over again, the brain conditions itself to just stop trying, because when you gain hope and then that hope gets taken away from you because of some, again, external factor, it's really painful and it's very traumatic on the brain and the brain's ability to survive. So that it's essentially just saying, shut down and stop caring, because this is the best way for you to continue on living. And so what happens is that you see these homeless people. And when we were doing research gathering from the community, like how do you as a community look towards the homeless? It was horrible. I mean, you're hearing things like just burn them all, kill them all, ship them out to California, make it some other city's problem. They, you know, deserve to be homeless. Those people on those streets have earned their way to be there. They're all a bunch of drug addicts, like essentially referring to them as this like worthless pieces of shit. And it's horrible. Like we as a community do not look at the homeless very positively. And it's because we see this learned helplessness. And so it's kind of like a catch-22 problem. It's like the city and community doesn't believe in you because all they see is drug addicts and feces on the streets and trash everywhere. And because your community doesn't see you as a part of it, you've essentially resorted to becoming this isolated fringe society, invisible because you're trying to protect yourselves. And so there's no civic engagement or social capital on either side. So that's where the idea of Wolfpack came in. And how this actually idea became inspired was that not this year at ETH Denver, but last year at ETH Denver, they did this whole Buff-a-Dow. When you showed up to the conference and you were a hacker, they gave you this coin with a QR code on it. And when you scanned that coin, it actually had money on it. And it was a Buff-a-Dow burner wallet, and it was used with XDAI. And so you could only really use that money at the conference. You could go up to these food trucks, they'd scan your coin, and then you'd get a meal. And so I'm sitting there with Bill, and I'm like, they just did the proof of concept for us. Like they just proved that by us being here, we are giving some sort of value to them. And in exchange, they're going to pay us with this burner wallet coin that they've now created a partnership with these food vendors to be paid out. And I was like, I can't go take this coin and go to 7-Eleven. I can't take this coin and go to the liquor store, but I can take this coin to this food vendor who's agreed to be a part of this ecosystem, and I can now get a hot meal. So when we were thinking through Wolfpack, we took into account all these different things that we had seen in our research, and we said it's more than creating an accessible labor market, but it's creating a system that actually empowers them to succeed. Because right now, all the systems that exist to either allow them to coast being homeless or actually kind of positions them to fail. And so Wolfpack would not only be a token-based gig economy that provides this accessible labor market, but it would also be able to show identification, work history, a personalized wallet, wage theft protection, and financial empowerment to the homeless. And so our way of being able to do this was using blockchain. And so this is kind of like the grand ecosystem of how we think that this could be made. But essentially we work with an employer. The employer sets up an identification on the blockchain using something like Fortmatic. And so that employer creates a contract with Joe, our homeless individual. So the example that we used is like, you know, it's at the end of the night, you know, maybe Joe's not totally ready to be around a bunch of people, but Joe is capable to show up, you know, before the store closes and wash dishes for 2 hours. And so Joe shows up and the employer starts a contract and Joe has to agree to it. And so that contract has to get started and ended by both parties so that there's no sort of discrepancies towards, hey, you worked this long, but I actually thought I worked this long. Or, hey, you said you were going to pay me $15 an hour, and now you're only handing me $10 cash. Like everything's done on the blockchain, everything's recorded, it becomes a public record. And so what that does is it guarantees that both the employer and Joe feel empowered in this agreement that they have between both of them, but it also prevents wage theft. So when the contract gets ended, the employer says, hey, Joe, you did great. You worked your 2 hours. Joe's like, yep, I worked 2 hours. I'm agreeing that I'm ending. We're done. Joe gets paid out right away. So if Joe is getting paid, let's say $15 an hour, Joe now has $30 in Wolfpack tokens, and Joe can take those Wolfpack tokens and he can go to participating vendors. And so we spoke with Chainlink about the ability to do off-chain transactions because we didn't want this like limitation with our vendors about, hey, you're having to deal with blockchain and you know, they paid you $5 for this cup of coffee and now that $5 you got is only worth $3 tomorrow. So utilizing kind of the stable coin concept to make sure that our money in the ecosystem stays stable so that all parties are equally benefiting. But there's restrictions to the coin. So, you know, Bill and I have, sorry?
Great information, Alex, so far. Can I ask a couple questions?
Yeah, go for it.
On here, you have this ETHR. Is that specific? What is that representing?
So that's Ethereum. So
okay.
One of the things that we were trying, yeah, so one of the things that we're trying to figure out is there a way for us to just make simple transactions where we're not doing Ethereum to DII to XDII? I know that Ethereum's generally ETH, but I probably spelled it wrong.
Yeah, you should probably change that.
Yeah,
okay,
I'll fix that.
The other question I had was, is the employer's funding locked in some kind of escrow account? So basically, there's no way they can hold it back.
Yes, exactly. And so that's where you see like the POA network kind of at the bottom. So this is again like a much more built out idea that we're not even there yet. But one of the thoughts that we were having is that we are holding this money in a sort of escrow and like we are functioning as that escrow account system. Why not try to utilize that hold of cash? So like if there was a way that we could utilize the POA network to even gain interest on it or build it where it could be low cost transactions, then it would be to the benefit of both the employer and to Joe. And so if we had money sitting and waiting, one thing that we were trying to consider is that there's different blockchain technologies that are currently out there that allow you to sort of gain or build assets the way that you would a mutual fund or an index fund or some other investment account. And I don't think there's really a homeless person out there that has a 401k or, you know, a bank account with interest. But if there's a way that we could hold money in some sort of escrow to like guarantee that that money is protected so that Joe does get paid out. But in that meantime, while it's being held, is there a way to capitalize on it and build interest? That hasn't been fully thought through yet, but with talking to people at ETH Denver, we know that there's a lot of different solutions out there where that could be possible.
Great.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, just a last question on the PayPal, the Chainlink PayPal capability. Is that in production?
No. So what we were able to build was with Fortmatic, but Bill's actually been talking to the people at Chainlink pretty frequently about how we can get that as a potential. So Chainlink's expensive currently. So like getting it integrated, like the cost to be able to support and be able to do it, like we're not at that point yet. Yeah. But we've been working with Chainlink and they actually approached us after the conference and they were like, we love your idea. As you guys start to actually get the tech behind this built, like please contact us because maybe we could even give you some sort of like pilot program that you could be able to utilize to get this going. And then as it builds, we'll look at, you know, a cost basis fee. But they were one of the biggest supporters.
What you really just need is some kind of fiat bridge, right?
Yes, we don't want vendors to have to deal with cryptocurrency. And so one of the things about Chainlink is it allows off-chain transaction. All you need is a PayPal account and you have the ability to get paid. Actually, a lot of the food truck vendors were totally cool receiving Ethereum. They were like all for it because at the time it was totally skyrocketing. But we just can't make that assumption that all vendors are going to be cool being paid in cryptocurrency. And so this allows them to have a much more sort of stable and secure relationship with us because every party here is taking risk in some way. You being the employer, you're taking risk hiring a homeless individual. You being the vendor, you have less risk, but we kind of want to mitigate that so that it's not a complex ecosystem for everybody to take part in.
Very cool. I think Mary might have had a question. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mary.
No problem. I interrupted you technically. I'm wondering what the interaction between the employer and Joe looks like and how they establish this relationship and create this contract together.
So what we've done is we've gone off of the current sort of solutions that exist within at least Denver metro area. So there's Buyout Enterprises, which is a company that goes out and like trains homeless individuals to go and get jobs. And so we've done a lot of research with them and working with Fort Lyons, which is like a homeless rehabilitation center that gets people from homelessness into this program and then pushed outwards. And so one of the things that we had kind of figured out was that we need to be working with the city of government to sort of recognize chronic homelessness almost as a disability, because then that way the employer has the same incentive to hire a veteran as they would a person with Down syndrome, as they would a person who is homeless. And so one of the sort of first steps forward that we realized would be a really easier sort of community collaboration, if you will, is if we worked with homeless individuals who are veterans, because then the tax incentive is actually already there. Denver has a lot of different military bases, and so we tend to be a state that's very pro help our veterans. And strangely enough, in our research, helping veterans is one of the few things that uber right and super left can actually agree on. You talk about war, you talk about military, everyone has their own opinions, but when you talk about helping veterans, there seems to be this like community of like, oh yeah, that's a really, really good cause. And so one of the programs that we looked into is something called Comeback Yoga. And it's a program that's already in place. They already have the infrastructure, they already have the process, but what they do is they work with veterans and they get them yoga certified, because they found that yoga is actually a really, really great practice to help treat PTSD. And so they've brought homeless individuals off the streets like through this yoga course and like trained them to be certified yoga instructors. And the program's, I think, in its 5th year, and they said a lot of their members that come to yoga every week were there the first week that they kicked off the program 5 years ago. So it's just working with employers. A lot of it's the communication. We've talked to many city council members about what are our drawbacks, what are our difficulties going to be with this? And I told them, I go, look, if you guys don't address this problem, it's not going to go away. Like I keep going back to the infection example. Like if you don't treat an infection properly and just leave it alone, like it will fester, it will get worse, it will spread. And I see it in my neighborhood. Bill sees it in his. Like the homeless population is growing and it's everywhere. And we keep having these issues with rat infestations, with like homeless people like sitting and camping out in front of storefronts. Now stores are suffering. It's like, if they're becoming an economic strain and a problem to your business, then like you better recognize that you need to be a part of the solution, because this will continue to negatively affect you. And so we have talked to a couple of employers, and we realized that like one of the best places to start is places that are already doing that. So like King Soopers grocery store is a big hirer and employer of people with disabilities. Goodwill, Salvation Army, working with Mile High United Way, like they have partnerships throughout the city of like city-based projects. So we have to start very much in a pilot and learn from it before we start expanding out to, you know, your smoothie shop down the street, or, you know, your retail store, that this might be a very new kind of strange concept to them.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, and how you shaped the problem with discussing the invisible population and the place of nonprofits and their existing relationships with people experiencing homelessness. What I'd like to see from your presentation is how you take, you know, prototyping what you have through existing partnerships with nonprofits to then bridging out to that invisible population that nonprofits and the government aren't touching yet. Because I think that's something you really emphasized in the beginning. So I'm curious to see where that goes, because I think there's a lot of potential there. And then on, if you are, you know, using existing relationships or government or nonprofit projects to kind of lay out the framework for what you're doing, I'm wondering if on the vendor side, if the SNAP program could be something existing that you guys can leverage to talk about like how food payments can work. And if you've done any research in that.
So we actually have, SNAP was one of our biggest inspirations, because Bill and I personally have actually both been on food stamps. So we know what that world is like. And that was actually where we saw a problem in the system, is that one of the issues with food stamps is that you have to have an ID and a social security number. So it completely ostracizes people that are chronically homeless or who are illegal immigrants, which are in the homeless system. And then the other issue with it is that trying to purchase certain things on food stamps you can't do. So like if you needed Band-Aids, if you needed medical supplies, if you were, you know, COVID-19, if you needed to get a mask, if you needed to get cough syrup, if you needed to get any sort of medication, food stamps will not allow, tampons, food stamps will not allow you to purchase those things. You can't actually purchase a hot meal. So if I went to the grocery store and I wanted to buy a hot meal from their deli, food stamps will not allow you to purchase that. And so that was one of the biggest drawbacks that we saw with food stamps, is that it's very, very limiting. And instead of making them feel empowered in their purchasing abilities, it was actually quite restrictive. And so we know that it can exist because there is a government-based program that allows for it. We just need to sort of integrate and build on it in a way that's taking into account kind of all these limitations. And so SNAP was actually one of our first things that we looked into. And to your nonprofit question, so we have one really good partnership right now, which is with Mile High United Way. Unfortunately, most of the nonprofit homeless organizations that we spoke to before all of this are just like completely underwater right now, dealing with the homeless population with COVID-19. So we've kind of had to put a lot of our outreach on hold. But Mile High United Way has been one of our greatest partnerships, and they said that we could become a part of their coffee meet and greet program that they do during the summer, which hopefully still happens. But it's essentially where they go out into the homeless populations and their encampments, and they start interviewing them, and they ask them to like get signed up for stuff like, would you want to work a volunteer shift and get a free meal or a hotel voucher? Would you want to sign up for an ID and get this in exchange? And so they go out and they have these conversations, and they bring them coffee and bagels, and they get to know the community. And they said that we would be more than welcome to do that. And then the other thing that they do is once a year, they do this Homeless Out Loud sort of event where they get probably about, I would say, like anywhere from like 3,000 to 4,000 homeless people in the city. Like they'll get buses to bring them in, and what they do is they help them write resumes and print resumes and find identification if they don't know where a social security number is or how they'd get access to it, gets them their licenses, gets them like set up with the free mental health facilities that are available in the city. So we know that some of the infrastructures are already in place, and Bill and I are not, we work for nonprofit, but we are not nonprofit experts. We are not trying to step in their territory. We are not trying to steal their funding. We want to be more involved in the public sector because we know the sort of difficulties that nonprofits have to deal with. And there's a lot of strict regulations into how they can spend money. So like, let's say there's $1,000. If you're a nonprofit, that $1,000, instead of going to a homeless or a man with 2 children who's not a drug addict, doesn't have a criminal background, the best candidate who could do well with that $1,000, like he needs it, he's homeless, his kids are homeless, that $1,000 will instead go to a homeless mother who is a drug addict, in and out of incarceration and in an abusive household, because she's more at risk. And so the problem with the nonprofit restriction is that the way that they are forced to spend funding puts those that are at the most vulnerable, not necessarily those that would succeed the best with those resources. So we do want to kind of be more of a support system to the nonprofits rather than trying to be a nonprofit.
Thanks.
Okay, cool. So that's kind of more of the bulk of it. And so this is our prototype that we built to kind of show the way that this would work. Let's see here. Wait, Bill, this is yours. So this would look like the work opportunities on the homeless individual side. So like one of the things that we learned in our research is that like a bulk of the majority of homeless people actually have smartphones. And so when we were doing our work with the Metro Denver Homeless Initiative, and I was doing these interviews of the homeless, I was like, well, you guys want contact information from them? Like, what do you want me to get? And they said, get an email address. Their phone numbers changed, but if you get an email address, you can follow a homeless individual for years. And I was like, really? And she was like, they keep an email address. It's like gold to us. So get that. And so that was definitely like a aha moment, because we were really unaware of like how plugged in the homeless population was. So they know where to get their free Wi-Fi, they know where they can charge their phones, they have their email addresses. Like the phone number will change and the phone could change, but they keep an email address. And so we're like, okay, so that we can actually work with. So this would be kind of on the side with what it would look like if you were the homeless individual Joe. You would see like the work opportunities that are available. And one of the big key things to the system, Bill, I'm trying to get to where the other one is. This is yours. I want to see the I want to see ours.
Are these demos publicly available?
Yes,
they're all
on the website. There we go. Okay, so this is where, if you are the vendor, so we have Restaurant 2002, and we use this example because a restaurant could both be an employer and a vendor. So there's this kind of public record of like how Bob or Joe, the homeless individual, is doing. So one of the things is we want to use positive reinforcement because they're so used to negative conditioning. So we're thinking like, okay, when you work your first job, you go and you show up your first shift and you complete it, like you get an award for that. So we're going to use game theory to kind of increase like this positive reinforcement dynamic. So like you completed your first job, you get an award for that. You worked one job every week for the past month, you get an award for that. You showed up to your first free behavioral health class, you get an award for that. You were an addict and decided to go to AA. Every time you go to an AA meeting, you get an award for that. And so what they do is everybody kind of starts as like a wolf pup. And as they gain these awards, they move up the system and they eventually become to Wolfpack leaders and they become alpha wolves. And the reasoning why we wanted to do that is one of the problems is there's not enough affordable housing. And the issue that Fort Lyons was seeing is that you're going to have these really at-risk populations. And if you're wasting all your resources on that small group of people that just genuinely don't give a crap and they just want the handouts and they don't want to improve their lives, then it's like, yeah, we're going to get those. So then why spend the time and the resources to kind of use something that's essentially going to fail? And so what they saw in Fort Lyons is that they kept a really, really good track record of people that like went the extra mile and were really trying to get their lives together, because then they were pulling resources because the likelihood that that person would succeed was far greater. And then they had data to show that. So for us, when people come in as a wolf pup, it becomes like a work history. It becomes a credit history. It's saying, hey, we know you're going to fail. We know you might not be able to show up to a shift every day. We know that, you know, yesterday you were strung out on drugs, but today you're doing okay. And you went and worked 2 hours. And so every time they try to make this small improvement, it's a step forward up this ladder. And they're kind of working through a program and they're graduating to be these alpha wolves. And so when we have a, you know, handful of alpha wolves, excuse me, those would be the people that we want to get access to long-term sustainable housing, because the likelihood that they will succeed is far greater than somebody who's just starting in our program. And then the other thing that we were kind of thinking is like, you know, holiday time is one of the biggest donation times. I do a huge homeless drive at our work every year. And what I've kind of started to be seeing is people were like, well, I would love to buy them a haircut. Or like, you know, what if they're trying to interview for a job? Like, it would be really cool if we could buy them like a nice, you know, suit or something that they could interview with. Well, if you see somebody and you want to contribute to Wolfpack, you could do that in a form of an award. So I'm a hair salon and I want to give a, you know, a glam award. And so somebody, you know, has their first interview and they've worked 5 jobs and they can build their tokens and they can trade it in for a glam award. And so now they have that buying power, but that also that gamification where they can, you know, store their points and trade it in for a glam award or maybe a hotel voucher, or maybe, you know, they want actually like a nice meal. You know, a lot of these homeless individuals are living off of scraps of others and these bare minimum handouts. So what if I, you know, stored finances and built wealth and now I have enough tokens to trade in for like a really nice meal at, you know, restaurant 2002. We kind of looked at it like, yeah.
I wanted to just quickly interject about, you know, why we're using all these wolf references. We provided some early research about how these people are really no longer part of the community, and the way the community looks at them as ostracized and outside. So they have that perspective that they're no longer in and they're making their own communities. We've also identified not only do they make their own little communities and packs, but that as people, you know, grow, and the mentality of a wolf pack really is that you're not alone. You are stronger in the community and the community supports you. And as you work your way through that community, we want to build leaders. We want people who coming from low and for each reward them on their path, you know, towards a more successful life, but also recognize that they can help bring others with them as a leadership. And there's just a lot of little stages where you can turn around and help bring people with you as opposed to just, you know, one person. That's it.
And thanks, Bill. And that's actually a big part of it. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so obviously you're using Fortmatic because they give you an easy way to interface, right, to blockchain. Does Fortmatic also support NFT style tokens, like ERC 721? And if they're a standard wallet provider.
I think it does. It just gives you an Ethereum address, and you can do a lot of things with it. And, yeah.
Okay. Just thinking through the rewards tokens, maybe it makes sense to have those be standard token formats that would then allow people to, it would allow your solution to have broad applicability outside of your client UX implementation.
The one thing that we are worried about, though, is creating a platform that didn't really allow them to share it with each other. We don't want one wolf person, one homeless person sending money to another. We're trying to prevent some of the problems that are being caused by that. So there's really more of a controlled use of this, which is why we're thinking of our own token.
Real quick question. And just, you guys have really thought out this very well. But also, it is complex. Have you worked like that user journey with folks to see if this is something that they're able to grasp and whatnot?
So this is kind of the very complex idea. So we've thought of what the minimum viable product will be. And the MVP's core kind of capability is that we would start with actually government sanctioned work, because other programs that have done a homeless to work sort of initiative, that's where they've started. That's where they've had the most success, is like, we need to change this idea towards the homeless, and that's going to have to happen in progression. And so one of the things that one of the programs did is during the summer, they had all the homeless go out and plant flowers. And so people kind of saw this and they're like, wow, you're planting flowers. This is really great. Like, I'm now seeing this community in a very different way, because they're now helping my community, this community that I live in, and making it beautiful. And so what we want to be able to start with is just the ability to pay a homeless individual, allow them to access that money, and then be able to use it at a vendor. The complexities of like identification and work history and tokens and reward system, those will be feature implementations that will go as we scale and we expand. But the bare minimum that we're trying to achieve is just the ability to get them onto the system and be able to access their money and buy something with it.
And I will also say that there are 3 use cases that we're trying to solve for. One is that when we get to onboard you and you have a smartphone. The second one is that you actually have a token that we give you, and you have a phone. So maybe you lost the phone, but you still have the token, you can still use that. But we onboard you with an email and a PIN. So if you actually lose this and you lose your phone, you have yourself. And if you could remember your PIN in your email, then you could pretty much use this system. So that's the lowest common denominator that we're trying to solve for. Mm-hmm. Then you may have the ability to have a phone and do a little bit more complicated as you graduate.
I have a question about that. One of the things that we're looking into is actually onboarding. That is like a big piece of the puzzle in what we're trying to solve. By the way, do you guys know about my past? I feel like I'm talking without asking you that question first.
You're a UX guy. That's what we know.
All right. I think we should give them a brief description of this, or should we save it to the end, Adam?
Adam's muted. Sounds great though.
How about I just run through this, and then you guys can just like hammer questions, because like we said, we know it's complex because so much research went into it. But where we get started, like, let's not reinvent the wheel if something already exists that allows for this. But that is a big thing. And, there are going to be homeless that are very mentally unstable, and we might not be able to get them onboarded. What we're trying to do is just kind of help give access and resources to the people that like could succeed if these barriers were removed, and start there. And then as we get more people kind of onboarded, we know that it will grow. But we're talking about starting with maybe 10 individuals that are homeless veterans that are more likely to succeed, so that we can learn from them first and see what the difficulties of onboarding are, see what the challenges are for them. So really starting small so we can learn from it. But if you were the restaurant vendor, this is kind of like the history so that people can see it. It also becomes a community pride. Like, a lot of companies are like, oh, we do a lot for the community. It's like, imagine if you could have like a Wolfpack sticker, in your front window that says like, we are a Wolfpack certified top employer. Like, if I saw that, that would mean something to me, because that means you're doing something to like help solve this problem and actually do something to empower people. So they can create a work ticket. These are ones that were already pre-created. And so they say, okay, he's going to be a dishwasher. We already have this ticket. I start the ticket, it gets timestamped. I find his ID, or I can scan it off of the token. Either one's an option. And then once I do it, it stores it. And so the cool thing about that is Bill's talking about what happens if they lose their phone and the token. Well, then we could start to utilize attestation as a possible sort of proof of identity. Like, I know that I've worked with this individual. Joe's great. He's come here 4 times. I can vouch that, this is him. And so we clock in. On the other end, Joe has to confirm that clock is starting, so that they know they're both agreeing on it. And the cool thing is when they end the contract, not only is it saying how long Joe worked and it's time stamping it, but you can give an award for like what he's done, but you can also give what Joe did. You know, Joe washed dishes, and then I had him, you know, roll silverware, and he took out the trash. He had a really positive attitude, and I would definitely hire him again. So now when Joe wants to go apply for resources, maybe get his first loan, you know, maybe get a full-time job employed by somebody else, like he has this track record now that kind of can attest to the person that he is and what he's tried to overcome. And then when we clock out, again, it gets added to the record. And the same thing goes with Sell. So we could work with these vendors and create almost like a homeless specialized meal plan, if you will. So they could go to your Starbucks coffee shop, and, you know, Starbucks tries to do a lot into the community. So we actually see them as a really good vendor that we could work with. But like, instead of charging, you know, $4.75 for your mocha latte, you could come in with your Wolfpack token and say, hey, can I get a coffee? And they charge you $1 instead. And then they can use that as a tax incentive or a tax write-off, because we'd essentially be working through like a government type program, or utilizing as like a pseudo working under someone else's nonprofit status. And so there is this incentive for both vendors and employers, because they can show all in one core system, hey, this is how much money I've given in discounts to homeless individuals, use that as a tax write-off, but they can also show it to their community. And so one of the biggest things here is that what we've noticed is that there's $40,000 spent per year on each individual homeless individual. And there's no return on investment. We've got nothing to show that we've made it better. We've got nothing to show that we've gotten people out of homelessness. Like, all we can show is that we've essentially allowed homelessness and being homeless to succeed and thrive. And that's not what we want. And so with our program, one of the key things here is the data. You know, after year one, I can show that, hey, we got 20 people onboarded to Wolfpack. They worked collectively 400 hours, and they put back, you know, $500,000 into your local economy and ecosystem. And that's something that we can't show right now. And so that's kind of a huge win for Wolfpack, is being able to show how the homeless individuals are a part of our community. They're working towards bettering their lives, and they're actually putting money back into those local vendors and, you know, the community economy.
So
and now questions.
Yeah, there's one pressing question that I would really want to ask. At the beginning, you know, you were kind of outlining these issues or this stigma that accumulates with someone experiencing homelessness, right? And in our own research with our project, which I'll save the pitch till the end, but we've also realized that. And it's also, you know, adding to that, it's also really interesting and really scary, I would say, how fast someone can deteriorate on the streets. Like, people think, oh, I would never be in that situation, but you know, take away all of your identity documents, take away your ability to work, and put yourself on the street, and you will be surprised how quickly you can get into a really bad spot. But you know, what I'm wondering is the perception that creates within, you know, that person's sort of like functioning role in society, right? Because you have all these vendors that are basically a pivotal. They're like the most elemental part of your program, is having these vendors that basically are participating, and they're giving people a job, but they're working under the assumption that, you know, that this will go well. Like, they'll have temporary employees clock in and out, and the experience will be, you know, good, which I'm imagining wouldn't always be the case, right? Mm-hmm. Because of substance abuse issues, because of cognitive disabilities, and because of this learned helplessness problem that you described, a lot of these people aren't as functional as, say, you and me. So when they get the job, you know, if they come in late, if they have a anxiety attack or something happens within the job, and that vendor kind of like has this now negative perception of this program and working with these vulnerable population, then they could essentially, like, you know, back out of it and be like, oh, we don't, this is not a good idea, this is not for us, kind of thing. So how would you kind of address that situation, I guess?
So that's why it was super important for us to create a gig economy. That way there's not as much of a commitment situation. So like, one of the things that we saw would definitely be an issue is that, these individuals were losing their jobs because maybe they are crack addicts or heroin addicts, and they were really good Monday and Tuesday, and now Wednesday they didn't show up for their shift, and so they got fired. And so the gig economy gives a little bit more freedom and flexibility to that constraint. So that's one of the things. It's like, if you have the hour of dishwashing work to give, great, but if this person, nobody picks it up, or this person doesn't show up, it's not going to be detrimental to your business operations or your ability to close down for the night. So that was kind of one of the key things that we wanted to make sure that we addressed, is that it was bite-sized pieces as opposed to trying to come and attack the whole thing at once. And so the gig economy kind of helps solve that. The second is
hey,
again,
Alex, there's also the work history, the ability for the employer to document and provide some feedback on the worker, gives potential other future employees also a little history of what kind of worker that you're bringing onto your job site. And to back up on what some of the nonprofits that we notice, when they want people who are willing to help themselves, like, we've developed a program. If you're willing to help yourself, we know you will succeed. If you're not willing to put forth the effort, why would we spend the money on you? So here's a little bit of an opportunity. And what generally that looks like is people actually testifying, being a sponsor before you go into the program. So what we're doing is creating like your own little sponsorship here. Is you've documented the history that I can come onto the job site and I can perform as necessary. But if you come up to a job site and then I see that you haven't completed a single thing, you've arrived 5 times and left early, well, why would the employer actually bring you onto that job site, right? You got to earn it, so to speak.
Yeah.
To follow on to Pablo's question, we also have an issue that we're dealing with where people are aware that being on a particular program essentially allows for that stigma or that label to perpetuate. Is there anything you guys are doing with respect to, like, is there a way to be on Wolfpack and not be experiencing homelessness? Or is there a way to be on this and not have that stigma follow them?
Adam, this is an interesting question, if I can start. We had conversations with actually Denver County. When they came to Eat Denver, they came with a Colorado bounty. And we just kind of figured that we would fall right in line, because we've been following the blockchain initiatives within Denver and Colorado, especially with Polis becoming governor now. And they actually had some of the same concerns, and they were steering us in a direction that says, why would you want to make them so different? How can you design this so that everyone is inclusive? Well, let's remember that we've already ostracized this entire population, that they are not part of our community. So this was a method to bring them in. And again, I want to reinforce the whole concept of a wolf pack. It's a community that supports each other. I'm not against bringing other people in if it's demonstrated that the community has learned to embrace the people who are homeless, embrace them to a point where you're willing to help them. But at this point, we aren't. So there's a lot of education actually on both sides that needs to happen. And at that point, I think that can become a reality. So like a my path solution actually becomes something really useful for the entire community.
But it also sort of struck me that, particularly as Alex was using the terminology gig economy, is that these types of bounties for work, right, are effectively what the Bounties Network was doing or what Gitcoin is doing. This is obviously a very specific use case, right, where Wolfpack is, a dramatic subset of the types of things that you would find on a platform like Gitcoin. But there might be an interesting opportunity to leverage something like that, which would allow people eventually to blend into a broader community, I think is what Adam was getting at, in terms of the things that they've done, right? And not be, hey, I'm a member of this ostracized community forever, right?
Maybe it's the Spirit Airlines of Gitcoin.
And so that's one of the things that we had kind of seen is, so we talked to Owen House. And so what Owen House is they're houses that essentially are in your community. You're not even sure that you have them in your community. We actually have Owen houses in my neighborhood, and what they are, they're completely sober living. And so when we talked to one of the directors of Owen House, he actually was an Owen House member. And he said, I've actually still been living in the houses. he's been living in the houses for 15 years. And so we're like, this is really interesting because you started as like an addict. He said when he walked into the houses, all he had was the backpack and a backpack and the clothes on him, and that was it. He says 15 years later, he's now like a director. He's a paid position. He's got health insurance. He's got all these things. And we were like, well, why are you so willing, like choosing to live in the Owen house? He goes, why fix what's not broken? He was like, why would I change what helped make me succeed? Like, he was like, I love the guys I live with. They keep me sober. They keep a good head on my shoulder. He was like, that's my community. He's like, you don't walk away from your troops. And that just like kind of hit on an entirely different level, is because he saw them as this group of people that helped him get to where he was today, that helped him succeed. And so he wore it like a badge of honor. And that's why we saw kind of being an alpha wolf. Like, that is a very strong name to give to somebody. Like, you are an alpha wolf. It's the same way that people walk around with their sobriety coins, and, you know, they've got their 2-year token or their 4-year token. Like, that's something to be proud of. And when we were interviewing a lot of the homeless individuals, it wasn't so much that they were upset about being stigmatized as being homeless. It was the way that people treated them. And so one of my last interviews that I had broke my heart. Like, it literally brought me to tears, is this guy said thank you to me. And I was like, didn't really do that much. Like, I gave you a bag of food and some socks, and you like filled out a survey. And I was like, thank you for what? He goes, no one's talked to me like a human being in a really, really long time. And I was just like, and it's not even like I went above and beyond. Like, I was just asking questions, and I gave out some, you know, granola bars and some socks. And he was just like, people don't treat you like you're human. And it wasn't his fault. He had lost his job because he had gotten a brain injury on the job, and like his workers' comp didn't come through, and then he couldn't afford the lawyers, and then loan predators came after his mortgage, and now all of a sudden he's in a bunch of debt. He lost his home, like just all these things. And so, you know, one of the things, and I think Pablo, you had brought it up, like, every person is one bad month away from homelessness, and this COVID-19 has brought that to a reality, I'm sure, for a lot of people. Like, you no longer have your stable income. Like, this cushy life that you thought you were going to have now just got taken away from you. And like, we will see this have dramatic effects on people's abilities to afford their homes and pay rent. And so we look down at the homeless because we so desperately don't want to be them. But the part that we're missing is that every person's one bad financial mishap away from being that. And so I think the homeless just want to be treated like people.
Agreed. And, you know, you just mentioned something really interesting that's been kind of like in the back of my mind, because I think, you know, this whole crisis is really going to bring about a new wave of homelessness and a new wave of people that are struggling to find a new job, because so many people are losing their jobs right now. So it would be interesting to think about, circling back to Adam and York's point, it'd be interesting to think about this ecosystem in a broader sense, where not necessarily restricted to people experiencing homelessness, but also, you know, someone who is struggling to find a job and needs a quick gig to find a hot meal, or to do their laundry, or to get groceries. I think there's a good opportunity to think of extensibility in that sense. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not that you're ignoring people experiencing homelessness. On the contrary, it is that you are including them on a greater ecosystem that isn't just exclusively targeting them. It is targeting everyone who's struggling with financial issues.
And I mean, I think the two key things that we're solving here is you can't get access to a bank account and you don't have a form of ID. And there are people that are in that situation who aren't homeless. There are people who can't open bank accounts, who don't, you know, are illegal immigrants, that are kind of living under the radar, who might not be homeless. Maybe they're staying in someone's basement or on a couch. Like, they might not fall into the homeless stigma, but they still might have those.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Alex.
No, it's okay.
Like, I forget the exact numbers, but it's like 1.6 billion people around the world fall into that category.
And that category is going to become really important in a couple months, where I think the $1,200 has been approved to people, but it's only people with bank accounts and IDs.
Or what happens if you are a self-employed individual? I mean,
if they had a wolf token, you know, Wolfpack.
By the way, Adam, I believe it also excludes undocumented immigrants.
This is fair.
Yeah.
I had another question about, and it has to do with your exchange. A lot of the folks that we have worked with, oftentimes are in a situation where their wages are garnished at their second paycheck. And so, right, these are folks who have outstanding child support and things of that nature, who, because of that, they only accept cash employment right? In order to just get past that second paycheck. With Wolfpack, would you guys fall into that issue at the exchange level?
So that's kind of where it comes into play, where like Bill and I recognize for this to succeed, we have to be involved in government initiatives and in the public sector, because one of the things is we don't want people taking advantage of the system, right? Like as a Wolfpack employee, are you getting taxed? Personally, I would want it to be a no. I'd want this to be, as an individual, you're not getting wages garnished because you're technically making under a certain income level. So I think that is a part of it, is that if you do have a social security number and we are able to recognize that, I mean, we don't want people taking advantage of this and seeing it as a way to like make money tax free. And so those are components that have to get thought through. And I think getting more at the government level and speaking with people who understand that at a deeper level than we do is going to be really, really important, because it's supposed to be a means to get your life together. It's not supposed to be a way that you can store X amount of money. And so I think there might be caps to the restriction of how much money you can keep on here. So I think one thing that we were talking about is like, you know, we don't want somebody to have like 20 grand in Wolfpack tokens available on here. Like at that point, is the system still serving what it was originally supposed to?
Yeah, I would say that there's no law on dads from personal experience, but this is definitely more about giving people opportunities to survive, as you know, and they're really not giving us enough information for us to identify who they are. However, with more identity could potentially become more reward. So if you actually do want to provide a name, if you do want to provide a social security number, that does give us, maybe we can offer more, but then now you're susceptible to different government regulations. So how do you want to live in that community?
I mean, and there's a way to pull, like if somebody does get a physical permanent address, right? So like one of the biggest things is that people on this platform do not have a physical permanent address. And so once they do get one, there might be another sort of level again, like they could be converted to the Alpha Wolf model. And like, what does that model look like? So it's almost kind of thinking of like, you know, different levels of membership in a way, because our main goal is to help serve the chronically homeless who don't have bank accounts, who don't have identification, who don't have physical permanent address. And like those three are very much like the underlying baseline. You know, as they start to graduate, we do have to think through what that graduation looks like and how can Wolfpack morph to better serve that need? Because hopefully at that point, as an Alpha Wolf, we would have gotten them on some sort of ID. Maybe we've gotten them on some sort of permanent work program. Maybe they're in application to get physical permanent housing. So that part is definitely down the line, where, you know, Wolfpack and what it provides will have to morph to better serve those needs.
Very much on a home first mentality, but in order to arrive at such a mindset, you need the platform to get there. I've had a really hard time not thinking about that future, where we just give people really simple homes to recover and become human again. But we're not there yet. Even though we've actually have some success within Colorado of doing that, and I'm targeting type of people so that we know that they will be successful, but there's not enough resources or buy-in currently to support it. So hoping this platform can support those who are succeeding in that endeavor, to demonstrate that to the rest of not just our community, but, you know, the country and the world.
And so the city of Denver recently basically came up with $71 million to help solve the homeless problem over like the next year. And so we're trying to work with Downtown Denver Partnership and like get our foot in the door with them, because they're going to be a big deciding factor of how that money gets spent. And they know that a big chunk of it has to go to affordable housing. So I come from the cooperative model. So when I was in college, I couldn't afford to eat and go to school. Like those two things did not coincide into the same world. And so I found the ICC co-ops, which is the Iterative Cooperative Council, and they are houses that were donated to this cooperative nonprofit in the city of Ann Arbor, Michigan. And so if you were a University of Michigan student, or even not a student, just like living in the city and couldn't find affordable housing, you could go into these co-ops. And so the co-op I lived in was with 32 people. Everybody had a roommate. You had, you know, I think 10 bathrooms shared between 32 people. Everyone was expected to pull their weight. I was the food steward, so I went grocery shopping for 32 people every single week. You were responsible for cooking for your housemates, cleaning. You all had house chores, and it was part of this very democratic community-run house. And it helps me survive and succeed. And that's how Owen houses are run as well. And that's what really helps kind of support this Wolfpack mentality, is like, you might not like your counterpart or the person sitting next to you, but like, if they don't pull their weight, you suffer because of it. So like, everybody better be working together, because whether or not you're eating that night, whether or not your groceries get delivered on time, whether or not, you know, the electric bill is getting paid, like that is a pulled weight. Everyone has to work together for that to succeed. And we found that they succeed in their encampments because that's who they trust. So our goal is that we could eventually get our Alpha Wolf members to kind of graduate together and then get access to cooperative housing, and just having to work with the city and figure out a way to do that, because we don't want to create the projects. That's what happens when you get free housing, is you get the projects and they're depressing and they're horrible and they don't work. And instead we want to create communities.
Going back to the whole onboarding thing, like I was saying, that's a very big piece of the puzzle, right? And especially when you're dealing with a population who, you know, has challenges, mental disabilities, or what else. I'm interested in the username, email, password sort of component that you guys have going on. What if someone forgets that? Like, what if I have trouble remembering my password? How would you go about like recovering your account if you couldn't access your email anymore? Or is that just not possible?
I could say a few things. We hinted on attestations with the employer, but I think what model that has me really intrigued is the Argent wallet with Guardians. These are very much like having a sponsor. If you were going to a AAA meeting or something, you have a sponsor. So there's nothing stopping us from creating those Guardians. If you don't have one, it could be another person's access. These are just preliminary though. We really want to make it simple, and we acknowledge that there are people on the street who probably can't remember their own name. We're not going to be able to help them on this model.
So just to clarify, so William, sorry, so Argent is a social recovery essentially?
Argent is a wallet. It's an
online
wallet.
But the pattern you're describing is basically a social recovery.
Yeah,
that's what it sounds like.
So that sponsor could be it's that attestation component. Like that person can vouch for who you are in your identity.
It could be two-factor. It doesn't have to be another person. You could set another person, but you could also use another address to verify your account.
Sure. Yeah, there's Adam and the team know this. There's some work that Microsoft Research did on MFN multi-factor, essentially specifically for this problem, which is how do you recover access to a key. It has not been published yet. I'm sort of chomping at the bit to see the work that they've done, because it's actually supposedly a very sophisticated sort of protocol level scheme that allows you to do all types of MFN, where the N factors can be all different types of things, which, you know, we could probably come up with some interesting homeless sort of schemes that would work well, you know, in terms of the different types of challenges that people might have.
York, are you talking about something beyond the fuzzy paper?
Yeah, no, I was talking about that paper. It hasn't been published.
Yeah. No, it's good stuff.
Yeah.
So I would like to ask a question, because maybe it's not a question, it's more of an observation here. My impression is Austin is really coming at this from almost a decentralized way, where we thought maybe we would start with a more private manner, more controlled. And when it comes to onboarding, like when we mentioned the certain types of days that happen in Denver, these are opportunities where we can actually sit with someone, talk to them, onboard them ourselves, and get them ready. Not just like, hey, I want to opt into the Wolfpack token. That's not something that we're prepared to handle. I thought I might bring that up now.
Yeah, that's a good point. Something that we're certainly looking at ourselves is, you know, how do you actually onboard users? It's a huge challenge and we haven't figured it out. So I just wanted to hear about your options and how you're handling that. I have a couple more UX questions, but they're very specific questions. So I don't know if they're appropriate for this conversation, or maybe I could actually get your two UX designers to give me their contact details so we could follow up.
Yeah, whatever you guys want.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
So you, there are definitely similarities in our approach to a lot of the stuff, but also, as you've noticed, mentioned, there are big differences in that we are taking a very decentralized approach. We are cognizant of the fact that even though we consider ourselves benevolent actors within the system, that the people who run the system after us may not be. And so consequently, we're designing it in a way that that people's identities, specifically their identities, are protected, irrespective of who's actually running the system. And so we are taking a very deliberate approach with respect to that. Which the flip side of it is we aren't providing a community like you guys are. We're not right. For us, everything surrounds the documents that you use to verify your identity. How can we convert those from physical things that are getting lost to digital things that are not getting lost, and yet still be accepted by the people who need to see them, right? And so when you go to get a house, and specifically when you go to get a housing voucher, right? You show up with your housing packet, and today HUD requires that you have the original your original photo ID, right? They won't accept a copy. They won't accept a scanned document. And so we're trying to work through, okay, well, how might we accept one of those, and how might we make that work? And so everything for us so far has been just around maintaining identity and protecting identity for these folks who would then use it right in whatever capacity that they currently do it. So we're not integrating with HMIS. We're not integrating with any of the applications that case managers are currently using for.
Good, I'm gonna stop share.
Sorry, the applications are currently using for service navigation. We're simply trying to provide a link into that system that the individual has access to. So today, many of the case managers, they actually hold on to physical copies, if they can, of people's documents just to keep them from getting lost. And so it's our intent to not have to have that anymore, right?
You know, Adam, I think it was pretty clear when we listened to your presentation, and I read as much as I could about what you guys are looking to solve and how you're trying to solve it, that you are taking a human-centered design approach, and it seems like your users might be a little bit down the road from our users. And I'm curious, and I think that there's a great chance and opportunity here to like graduate into this methodology that you've got. Our trick is trying to deal with people who don't trust anyone, and they will not give you, because like as Alex has used in the past, I'm not going to give you my name because I have a parking ticket from 10 years ago. So that mentality is just a little bit different. And I understand it and I get it. Plus, the more things like attestation begin to grow, the less that documents have an importance. So if 1,000 people and 3 different government agencies are willing to attest that you are who you are, what good is my driver's license that I have a photocopy of on my digital, on my wallet? But the opportunities are there, and I see that you're at a place where people have identified a problem, and if you can solve that, and if we can get you those people, I think we want to get there. Of which I would like to say that a partner who is not currently on board, who was involved in our ETH Denver, is a data scientist, and he's extremely interested in the documents bounty. He is not competing with this incubator with us, but he is still very much interested in that idea and does want to actually pursue some of that. Thought I'd throw that out to you now.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah. So I think maybe what I can do is I'll reach out back to him and basically see if I can get him involved in any way to start thinking about that project.
I noticed the same thing that you were talking about with respect to where people were coming onto this. Even within Austin, we have a downtown group and a south group two separate communities of people experiencing homelessness. And the downtown group it's used to receiving services. They're used to giving their name. They're used, right? They're very familiar with this. The group down south, not at all. Some of them are currently living in the woods, right? And
that's what we have. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're looking at trust. Maybe so. If this Wolfpack succeeds in demonstrating that we are a community who cares, and that being a part of this community is actually looked at as favorable, and you begin to trust the actual platform, then asking for things like your name may not be such a burden. But we have to establish that trust within the community for both on the community side as well as the homeless side. And we have one way of doing that, which we can't do right now, but there was an outreach plan here, and hopefully we'll get to do it, where we do with this interactive wall down in the encampments. And I basically want to pose 2 different questions and give them supplies to create some art in response. I want to ask how you feel the community supports you and just what their gut reactions are. And then I want to ask on another board, ask them, how can this community support you? And that's just one way of demonstrating that we're listening and building some of that trust in those coffee conversations that we were talking about earlier. Can't exactly do that right now, but that's in the future.
I'm hoping one place that we can share is as we develop methodologies for people to log in and to sign on. That hopefully we can do that in a way that we can share, because I feel like we both have that issue of the folks who they lose their token, they can't remember their PIN anymore, right? How do they get that back? We are going to attempt to solve that so everything that we're doing is open source. You guys are in the same boat, but even further into that, we're going to try to solve the logon piece as a separate standalone thing that other people can easily import into their application as we learn more, as it gets better. We're going to try to implement a lot of the stuff that York was referencing before, just from a technical side. But then, right, there's a massive design component to that.
And speaking about that, actually, I think there's a lot that we can share when it comes to usability rules and working with this particular population. Because I mean, even though I think you bring up a really good point, Bill, when you say that our users differ in the sense that we're working with people that are willing to get back in the system and procure these IDs, get them up on a platform, try to get access to these like formalized services that require them. Whereas you're more so dealing with people that are sick and tired of all of that, and they are really on the opposite side of the cord, where they're like, oh, I don't want anything to do with government. But still, I think some of the underlying issues and the things that these people are experiencing, again, cognitive disability, substance abuse, mental illness, all of these are applicable and overlapping with both types of users. So there's a lot of opportunity there to kind of like share our findings as to what works best when it comes to interaction design, when it comes to user experience design, these very important topics. Because at the end of the day, whether or not people are going to use our platforms entirely depends on the user experience.
100%, Pablo. And Alex and I have actually taken on this launch and learn within the company that we work. This is like the second or third time we've tried to describe blockchain to our community. And this time, the challenge is not to use anything that has anything to do with the blockchain. So we're going to describe it all in words and terms that they're familiar with, and not try to use anything like hash or transactions or really anything. And to be honest, the success of blockchain will happen when people stop talking about blockchain and we just start acting as humans the way humans usually act. So that is a real strong driver.
That is a blockchain murder mystery party. Like, we are doing blockchain in a murder mystery party.
Okay, that sounds like fun. Can I be invited, please? Adam and Pablo, I think one of the interesting things that came out of this discussion was that you have a different user persona than Wolfpack, and I would love to see the distinction between those two.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, York, I would like to see Wolfpack to really identify the different personas. Like, this is a person who works with this nonprofit and that's how they get employment. And so when they use Wolfpack, this is what their experience will be. This is some independent individual who is participating in the gig economy and is going to come into work this way. Like, I want to know what each person is. And then I think that if you present the presentation that way, and really flesh out what the MVP is and how you see the future extensibility of what you're building, you'll be able to tackle a lot of the questions that were asked throughout your presentation, early on, and kind of cover over those doubts that people had as you were presenting.
Love it.
One of the similarities that I noticed is this understanding of a housing ready community, or this high functioning community within the homelessness community. And it used to be that the model was housing first before it was most greatest need. And so it actually did used to work that way. However, it didn't have the concepts of housing first. Right. Yeah. Anyway, so like the system's evolving. Clearly they took a misstep here. In Austin, the folks who are high functioning, who are not on drugs, who are experiencing homelessness, who have like a 5-year wait time to get a house, they have branded themselves as middle-class homeless in Austin.
I love that.
That's a title.
Adam, where does Austin fall in terms of the tiny home?
We have some.
It's legal.
I'm sorry?
Are they legal homes?
I don't know. It's a good question. There is a specific tiny home community, but I don't have any background.
This is
what's the argument against that they're more like trailer homes?
It's right. So they are considered RVs. If you have wheels, they're allowed to exist. So they classify them as RVs. Mm-hmm. But typically something that's small is just not up to code for larger homes. Mm-hmm. And so most communities do not allow you to build these tiny home infrastructures, which would vastly create incredibly solve a lot of our problems. We can create tiny little niche communities for the homeless that have individual wolf leaders that make sure people are being accountable within their tiny little community. But it only works when you can build it affordably, and if you can build it small enough, you don't need a lot. And the reason why I'm such an advocate is here. How do you get off drugs? How do you get off your mental illness when you're laying on the street in 20-degree weather?
Yeah, the research from the Seattle tiny home community is incredibly compelling with respect to saying that is hands down the most successful way to help people resolve trauma first and then start to move forward.
Precisely. And so hopefully our platform can
great data point.
Build towards that. Yeah. Demonstrate how those people can succeed and how we're proving that.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I've got to jump off here, but this has been terrific, and I would love to follow up.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah,
what I can do is I'll invite the MyPass team to their Gitcoin chat where they're working on their incubator projects, and then you can communicate with each other. I'll also share everyone's email.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I got Bill's and Alex's email, so I'll definitely follow up with you guys on some of my UX questions. But yeah, very happy to have met you, and I'm excited to see what comes off of this this conversation.
Thanks so much for your honesty and your passion behind all this and your interest. And Mary, thanks so much for setting this up.
Yeah, sure. I also, for Bill and Alex, have some notes on your presentation and feedback for the incubator side of things. If you want to do that now or later, let me know.
Yeah, let's arrange another one because I've blown off my job for about 30 minutes now.
I know, I'm like, it's fine, it's Friday. Yeah, let's do another one.
Okay, sounds good. I'll reach out to you on Gitcoin.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Have a great day.
Bye.